Hey guys, we are back updating the Power Rankings for Big Brother Canada 12 towards the end of week 2, and this has been a bit of a crazy week where we had a plan change and just learning more about the people in the game, but we'll get to that soon enough. But there are 14 people to talk about, and as always, no more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 14, we have the boot for this past week, and here we have Janine. And this was to be expected. She was pretty much the target coming into week 1, and after she failed to win the veto, when she came pretty close to doing so, she largely just gave up, doesn't really try to stay that much, and she has voted out pretty handily there. And in a lot of ways, she feels like your pretty standard first boot, someone who doesn't really have that many connections in the game and was largely just a scapegoat for this women's alliance that Anthony was worried about during week 1. But obviously she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 14. And with that, there are 13 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based off their current game position. But number 13, we have the person who is the most likely to be evicted on Wednesday night, and here we have Donna, who ends up being backdoored here after not being the initial target, which is obviously pretty interesting by itself. I will say that even before she was a target, I wasn't feeling that high on Donna, considering it seems like she was in a pretty bad position. And you have people like Anthony and Victoria lumping her in with this East Coast alliance that was used as a way of shifting the target from Tola onto Vivic, which wasn't even that real of an alliance to begin with. It was more so just a day 2 thing. But that causes Donna to be in a pretty bad position. And even if Vivic had gone this past week, she probably would have been targeted not too long afterwards anyway, considering she's not really in the core of things. But she is targeted. We do see Victoria getting pretty upset by her, and that causes her to eventually shift the target onto Donna to where most of the people want to use the veto to take Viv off the block, and obviously that ends up happening to where Donna becomes the backdoor target. And really, she's pretty much screwed here. She doesn't really have a path forward. And I feel like against Elijah, who seems to be this pretty clear pawn, it makes sense that she'll go out here. And it's kind of a shame considering it just further cements the control that Anthony and Victoria have in the game, but obviously it kind of leaves Donna here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who is in quite a bit of danger coming into next week, but we do have Bailey. And I initially had Bailey a little bit higher, considering that despite her opposition to Anthony, there was a shot that she could have used that position to try to build an opposition to Anthony. But I feel like now, considering that Anthony and Victoria seem to be taking control of the game, it leaves Bailey in a pretty bad spot to where she'll probably be targeted sooner rather than later. And I think what makes things even worse is that she was lumped into this East Coast alliance that Anthony and Victoria seem pretty keen on targeting at this point. But even beyond that, Bailey doesn't play this week particularly well, where she gets into that argument with Vivic that was orchestrated by Victoria to try to paint the target onto Vivic over Tola. And even beyond that, you have her wanting to target Elijah in the pre-jury, which was pretty misguided there, considering Elijah is one of the less connected people in the house. And her losing Donna this week is pretty bad for her game, as it further puts her on the outs moving forward. So I feel like Bailey's in a pretty bad spot at this point, and with this former East Coast Alliance being targeted, she seems to be one of the bigger targets on the board moving forward, to where I have her here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone who is currently on the block, and here we have Elijah, also known as Goose, and he seems to be in a pretty bad spot. I said this last week, where it feels like he's one of the less connected people in the house. And I feel like now that we're learning more about the power structure in the house, I feel like that largely applies where really the only alliance Elijah seems to be in at this point is the directors. And while that alliance seems to have a decent amount of influence in the house right now, I feel like the fact that Elijah only has that and doesn't really have many relationships outside that is pretty bad, to where he is a very easy pawn coming into this week, which is a pretty telling sign as well. And you even have people like Bailey and Todd wanting him out relatively soon because he's so far out of the loop. So at this point, I'm not feeling that great about Goose. I feel like he, in a lot of ways, is primed to either be like a pawn star or someone who could be a very disposable person if someone doesn't want to make a big move down the road. So for the most part, I would say Elijah's in a pretty bad spot at this point. And while he'll probably stay this week over Donna, I can't really have him any higher than number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I had pretty low last week, and I still have them low this week, and here we have Tola. And Tola's in a pretty interesting spot at this point, where on one hand, he's obviously pretty bad socially, and it seems like a lot of the women in the house simply don't like him that much. So we're coming into this week, a lot of them were expecting Tola to be the target, and it largely took Victoria having to go out of her way to try to pin the target into Vivic that prevented that from happening. But even so, a lot of that's because people like Victoria and Anthony are using Tola as a shield. It's not even like they have this close bond to Tola. It's more so because of how annoying he is that they're just using him to like distract the other people outside their alliance. So I feel like for the most part, that's pretty bad there. And while he'll probably have some longevity in the game, I feel like it's probably not going to lead to a win by the end of it, to where he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who was supposed to be the target this week. However, things have changed since then, but we do have Vivic. And I'm actually kind of surprised that Vivic isn't lower on the list, considering that he was the target coming to this week. And before the Monday digital daily drops, it seemed very likely that he was on his way out, and that'd be talking about how like he was pretty much doomed here. But again, Victoria is the HOH, and she ended up changing her mind here, despite the fact that she did so much campaigning to try to pin the target onto him. Now, I will say that Vivic, for the most part, played this week pretty poorly, where he was pretty confused about like Victoria trying to get him to fess up to the East Coast Alliance, and in doing so, he ends up revealing a whole bunch of his other alliances, which is pretty bad there. And even beyond that, you have his argument with Bailey in the HOH room, which wasn't a good look. And even after Victoria decides to save him, you have him like pledging her loyalty to her, only to then say that he still wants to target Anthony, which again, I'm not too sure what to make of that. So again, I'm getting kind of mixed signs from Vivic at this point. On one hand, he is saying at this point, it seems like he's no longer the target for this week, which is pretty crazy. And you also have Dennis using the veto on him, so at least that's something. But even with all that, I'm not too sure where he's still going in the game, where even when Victoria was talking to him, saying that she was going to save him, we have him like pledging his loyalty to her, which is good. But then he says that he still plans to target Anthony, which is not that great. So, and obviously considering that Anthony knows that Vivic is planning to target him, I could see a world where Anthony still targets him soon anyway. You also have the fact that Victoria is still gung-ho about targeting this East Coast Alliance that she knows that Vivic is a part of. And I feel like if that is the targets for the next couple of weeks, Vivic is included in that. So I feel like that still puts Vivic in quite a bit of danger in the short term. So again, I feel like he's still not in a great spot, but considering that he was literally about to go home until a whole bunch of things changed, was enough to leave him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I had a lot higher last week because we didn't have as much information on them. But I feel like now that we have more about where they truly stand, I'm not feeling that great about them anymore, but we do have Todd. And again, I thought initially Todd was going to gel with the likes of Anthony and Matt for being this seemingly chill guy that would just win a lot of comps. However, now we're learning that he's actually not that well positioned within that, and in general is part of the minority, to where he was one of the first people out of the HOH comp. And even beyond that, you have him being lumped into the East Coast Alliance and being lumped with Bailey. And in general, it's not looking that great for Todd. He's going to be losing Donna this week, which is not good for his game. And even on that, he was talked about as being a target for this week, and if not, then he'll be a target for the coming weeks. So again, I feel like he's in a pretty bad spot at this point, and it wouldn't shock me if he's out the door in the next couple of weeks. But I feel like compared to people like Bailey and Donna, I feel like they're more likely to be targeted ahead of him, with obviously Donna going out this week. And I feel like Bailey's probably going to be the target for next week. So I do think Todd has a bit of time to recover, but considering that he's not really in the core of things at this point and seems to be on the outs, I can't have him any higher than number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who didn't really go up so much as other people moved down, but here we have Dennis. And realistically, I don't think Dennis is in that great of a spot either. Or similar to Goose, he doesn't seem to have that many connections in the house outside of Tola and Vivic. And obviously Vivic was going to be targeted for a lot of the week, and while he does end up winning the veto and using it to save Vivic, it feels like he did that largely because Victoria had already told him that the target has shifted and that she was giving him permission to use the veto there. So I don't really give him that much credit for saving Vivic there. And beyond that, you have the fact that he won the veto to begin with, his second veto in a row, so he's kind of standing out already. And while it's interesting to see someone like Dennis being the comp piece right out the bat, it also paints a target on his back for the future, so again, not loving that. So for the most part, I'm not that impressed by Dennis's game, and realistically, I'm not that confident in him to win from this point on, despite his comp ability. The reason I have him above the other people is he seems to be less of a priority at this point, where I feel like the people we already talked about are more likely to be targeted in the future, or someone like Elijah, who seems to be less connected than even he is. So I think that was enough to at least have him this high, but really I'm not feeling that great about him. So because of that, he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who did go down a little bit, not so much because I don't think they have longevity, but because I feel like they're just kind of passive in the game. But number 6, we do have Matt. And I think on paper, I would have Matt higher, considering he does seem to be in a pretty good spot within the game where he's pretty close to Anthony. And he's someone who, again, is pretty ingrained within the power structure at this point, with him being part of the directors and with him being pretty close to Anthony. So it wouldn't shock me if he has a decent amount of longevity on the season. But at the same time, I think he's also playing pretty passively right now. I feel like he's just kind of there within the game. And this is despite the fact that Vivic, one of his closer allies, came pretty close to going home this week. And the fact that he allowed people like Victoria and Anthony to try to pull him away from Vivic is a pretty bad sign in my eyes. And he seemed pretty complicit with allowing Vivic to be targeted and go home. Though obviously Vivic ends up being taken off the block, though that's pretty much due to nothing that we saw Matt do. So I am kind of conflicted on Matt at this point, where while he probably will be in it for a while, and while I feel like he has the potential to win a lot of comps, I'm not too sure how much credit to give him considering he doesn't seem to be playing that actively. We haven't really seen him talk much game on the digital dailies. So because of that, I can't have him higher than number 6. Now moving on to number 5, we have someone who I'm also pretty conflicted on at this point, but we do have Avery. And kind of like Matt, I feel like Avery is also set up to do pretty well longevity wise. I feel like she seems to be pretty well positioned, at least on paper in the house. But again, kind of like Matt, I feel like she's also not really that active in terms of the actual game, while she seems kind of aware of what's happening within the game. I think she's also a bit too willing to go along with what Anthony and Victoria want, which I do think is a knock there. Now, I think something I will give her over Matt is she does seem to have a bit more connections than Matt, where we have seen her connect well with Lexus and a lot of the other women. So I feel like to that end, I could see her doing pretty well to that end. But at the same time, she's also a pretty passive player, someone who I don't really have a ton of faith in at this point, though we'll have to see how the rest of the season plays out. But for now, I do have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who is kind of interesting to discuss, but we do have Lexus. And Lexus comes very close to winning the HOH, which I do think is pretty impressive there, kind of speaks to how well liked she is. But at the same time, we also see Victoria consider putting her up as a pawn, though she does back out of that eventually. But I do think Lexus is pretty well positioned in the house right now. She is part of the directors. She also seems to be pretty close to Victoria's side, the hot chocolate side, which I think will also put her in a pretty good spot moving forward. But beyond that, you also have her kind of having a showmance with Matt, which could lead to some game benefits down the road, though we'll have to see. I think the main concern I have with her at this point is, one, whether she'll be more active in the game. I think that'll be a big question. But also whether Anthony decides to snipe her down the road as a way of weakening people like Victoria or Matt. Or even though she has a pretty good relationship with Anthony at the moment, I could also see Anthony down the road wanting to weaken people like Matt to ensure that people like him are more in his corner than anyone else's. I could see Lexus falling victim to that. I could also see him trying to take out Lexus as a way of weakening Victoria down the road. Now, again, I don't think it'll be for a while, but I think those things are enough concerns to where Lexus should be a bit more active in the game. So again, I do have those worry signs for her down the road, but I feel like for now, she's in a good enough spot to where she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone kind of similar to Lexus, but with a few minor differences, and here we have Kayla. And I think Kayla's in a pretty similar spot to Lexus at this point, where she seems to be in the majority. Now, while she isn't part of the directors per se, she is part of Hot Chocolate, which is also a pretty powerful alliance within the game, so I think that definitely allows her some longevity there. But even beyond that, I think she seems a bit more independent compared to Lexus, where obviously Lexus has her showmance with Matt. I don't think Kayla will fall for that per se. And I think down the road, I could see a world where Kayla could build bigger bonds and branch out more to where she could eventually try to take a shot at Anthony and Victoria down the road. I'm not entirely sold that Lexus would do the same, so I think that's partly an edge for why I have Kayla above Lexus, but really I feel like they're relatively close in my estimation, which is why I give her the edge at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and obviously we are now down to the 2 vets, which I think speaks to the direction this season is going in. I am getting a bad sign that this season will probably be dominated by these 2 players, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, I do have the current HOH, and here we have Victoria. And obviously, Victoria had a pretty chaotic week, as you would expect. I feel like for the most part, she actually played this HOH kind of terribly, where she was running around trying to spread this whole information about the East Coast Alliance, trying to convince people like Bailey to turn on Vivic, and going so far out of her way to try to get these people to target Vivic or Tola, only to later change her mind and decide to target Donna, which to me feels pretty sloppy there. Again, I feel like her HOH is largely what you would expect out of Spicy V, but at the same time, I don't think it's really blown up in her face the way that it should have, to where her and Anthony still seem to be in one of the best spots in the house right now. And I would actually say that Victoria's in a better spot right now compared to Anthony, where at least Anthony has people wanting to target him. I don't think Victoria even has that. I feel like she has a pretty solid power structure that she's well positioned within. She's part of the directors. She's also part of Hot Chocolate. And in general, she seems to have one of the more connections in the house compared to other people. To where despite her sloppy HOH, I still think people will come out this week not wanting to target her as much. So I think that definitely puts her in a better position there. And you can also argue that she got one up on Anthony, where she does decide to target Donna in a spot where it didn't seem like Anthony wanted that per se, as Anthony wanted to target Vivic as a way of bringing Matt closer to him. So obviously, I would say that Victoria was playing a bit more independently this week, I guess, but still, the fact that she played such a sloppy HOH, I can't really reward that too much in the grand scheme of things. That, and also I don't think Victoria's the greatest player in the world compared to the number one person, to where I have her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Big Brother Canada 12 at this point is Anthony. Now, I will say that on paper, this week didn't go as well as it probably could have for Anthony. We're coming to this week, he was obviously better off targeting Vivic, as Vivic was one of the main people gunning for him. And even now that Vivic is staying in the game, he still wants to target Anthony down the road there, so that's not particularly great. And then you also have people like Bailey, who wants to target him at some point. So again, you still have these people in the game that want to gun for Anthony, unlike with Victoria. But at the same time, I have a lot more faith in Anthony as a player compared to Spicy V. And I think Spicy V being in the game and being in a good spot gives Anthony a lot of leverage moving forward, where he doesn't necessarily need to call all the shots in order to not be targeted there, as Victoria will step up to the plate for him. And even though Victoria didn't do what he wanted this week, I still feel like she'll probably want to work with him down the road. I feel like he's still pretty well positioned within this power structure. And to be honest, I feel like this power structure will probably steamroll for a decent amount of time, where I feel like the people that are gunning for him at this point, people like Bailey and Vivic, are people who are on the outs and who are at the mercy of people like Anthony and people within his alliance there. So I actually feel like Anthony's in a pretty solid spot at this point. I feel like he recovered pretty well after his own sloppy HOH. And I feel like at this point, he should be in it for a decent amount of time. It's just a question of whether his target will eventually catch up to him. But I feel like with the way the season is going, I just feel pretty solid about Anthony at this point, despite the issues that arose early on, to where I have him here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I am covering other shows at this point, such as Survivor 46 and The Amazing Race 36, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.